Okay, welcome back. So now we will steam into the week's news. Now, when we were talking last week, on last week's episode, we revealed that Bonza, kind of out of nowhere, announced that they were going to launch 11 new routes from a new base in the Gold Coast. And when they made this announcement, they said that this would happen via a wet lease agreement. And for those of you that aren't aware, wet lease is kind of industry mumbo jumbo for when you have another aircraft from another airline operate your flights, but you also have their crew do it as well. And they never actually said who the wet lease agreement was going to be. We sort of speculated incorrectly.
Very
incorrectly, with the authority.
Egg on our faces.
That it was going to be Alliance. We got it very wrong. And actually, they're going to be working with their sort of sister airline in Canada. Jake, talk us through this and what it means for the future of Bonza Legends.
Yeah, so we did speculate that it was going to be Alliance based on the fact that Alliance is based in Queensland and it's not affiliated with Rex. It seemed a logical choice at the time, but little did we realise that there was a more logical choice, which is, of course, Flair, a sister airline to Bonza, also sort of owned by 777 Partners, that also uses the MAX 8. I believe there were actually a couple of planes that had been earmarked for Bonza that went over to Flair because Flair was short of planes. But basically, the Flair aircraft and crew were going to fly Bonza-branded flights in the Australian summer, and then during the North American peak season, Bonza is going to send planes and people to Canada. So essentially, they're going to be using the same aircraft. I'm not sure if they're probably not going to repaint them every time. That'd be very expensive. But they're going to be using the same aircraft. It's just that over here, the Flair crews and aircraft will be operating Bonza flights, and they'll send Bonza planes and crew over to Canada to do Flair flights, which should be an interesting cultural exchange program.
Well, I mean, again, as another POM in Australia, I am not going to bemoan issues around migration. However, what I would say is that Bonza have built a lot of their brand on being this kind of true blue Aussie airline. They call their crew the Bonza Legends, and their aircraft name like Sheila and Bazza and all this kind of stuff. And what we're going to have is Canadian aircraft and Canadian crew operating Bonza flights. I think this is quite an innovative solution, but I could see how this is a tricky PR thing to navigate. Chris, what are your views on this? Because it does feel this is quite a tangent.
Personally, I think it's a recipe for disaster.
Big words from Chris.
Yeah.
Go on, Chris. Tell us.
There's a couple of things that spring to mind here. Number one, parent company, 777 Partners. Obviously, it makes sense for them to move aircraft between sister companies. What's not been reported widely here in Australia is that earlier this year, Flair had a heap of their aircraft repossessed for non-payment, leaving them with a shortage of aircraft, which is possibly why some of the Bonza allocated aircraft were reallocated to Flair. And I think there's a bit more behind that story. That I'm not across. Flair being a Canadian carrier, Canadians in general are warm and friendly, caring people. So I think...
And Australians absolutely are not.
Oh, we're the best. We're the best. But I think from a service point of view, it's going to be okay. I think where Bonza really need to make sure they play their cards right here is communicate efficiently and effectively to their consumers booking a flight ex the Gold Coast that the aircraft will be operated by Flair with Flair crew and aircraft, because I can see poor old Mrs. Smith rocking up at the airport from, Gold Coast to Townsville thinking she's getting on a Bonza aircraft with Bonza Legends, looking for a purple aircraft, seeing a black and green aircraft with Flair crew and being a bit confused when they talk Canadian with their Canadian accent. Yeah. Well, I think this can hurt the brand in the long run.
I do. I mean, I do see clearly when they were coming up with the Bonza Legend thing, this was not an idea that had come into mind. I think I said it was an innovative solution, and I'm going to bring you here, Jake. Obviously, the reason they've done this is it's now very hard just to get hold of any new aircraft, and it's actually very hard to find skilled, trained crew. That's they've kind of found a way around that. But surely, Jake, this is indicative of the kind of of wider problems we've got in the industry at the moment.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the 737 MAX has been delayed and delayed and delayed so many times, and there were all those issues with reliability and safety a few years ago that Boeing seems to have solved. But, you know, we all know that it took Virgin ages to get their first 737 MAX 8, Monkey Maya, haven't forgotten, lovely people over in Perth. It did take them ages to get their first 737 MAX 8. Bonza still only has the 4 of the MAX 8s. They're expecting the 5th sometime by the end of the year. And as we've discussed before, one of the issues with the MAX 8 is that it is a new plane and you need to train up pilots on the new plane. And so when some of those new planes are out of commission, then due to mechanical faults or bird strikes or whatever, then it's difficult to actually train the pilots up on them. This is one of the reasons why they axed 5 of their routes a month or so ago, was because they didn't have the planes and the crew to be flying all those 27 routes and making them economical. Now, obviously, they've added these 11 new routes from the Gold Coast, and these Flair planes are going to be helping with that. But it short of, again, partnering with someone like a Alliance, this was probably the most logical way to keep flying using the 737 MAX in Australia for an economical, through economical means.
It's interesting because this is a very innovative solution, and it actually reminds me of what we do with, and this might seem like a strange kind of analogy, but with bushfire fighting aircraft, right? Exactly the same idea, that you have a bushfire season at one time of the year in the US, and you have a bushfire season at another time of the year in Australia. And so it makes sense to these countries, when they're not going to have much use for these aircraft, moving them around. Nonetheless, Canada to Australia is a long way to have a partnership. Chris, in your years of aviation, have you ever come across a wet lease scheme quite like this?
Yeah, look, wet leases are not that uncommon, and we touched on it recently with Qantas and Finnair. Air New Zealand wet lease as well, with a Spanish carrier, Vamos Air. So currently on the Perth-Auckland, Auckland-Perth route, it's a Vamos Air aircraft and crew. So a Spanish airline operating a flight for a Kiwi carrier, because Air New Zealand didn't have enough aircraft to sustain the route. So rather than cancel the route altogether, bring in a wet lease. So wet leases are very common. So are dry leases. Dry leases being when you lease the aircraft only, but not the crew, and it's your own crew operating the aircraft. So not uncommon. They happen all the time, all around the world, and there are airlines set up specifically for leasing, where they will either lease an entire aircraft and crew, or they will lease an aircraft only. So not that uncommon. I just think in the long run it will hurt Bonza's reputation, and you know how much I love Bonza and how much I'm rooting for Bonza to come out on top and stick it to all the others. But I think in the long run, if they do not play their cards right, this could potentially hurt them. The other thing that springs to mind for me on this, Adam, and I know I'm kind of going off the question that you asked me, is when it comes time for this to be reciprocated, when Bonza need to send an aircraft and crew over to Canada to assist Flair in their northern summer, that's going to leave Bonza short an aircraft and crew here. So what's it going to do to their schedule here when they lose an aircraft to go offshore to Canada? And as you rightly said, it's a long way to go to send an aircraft for a summer schedule.
Well, this was actually the second kind of big wet lease story of the year. And the first one was that Qantas were going to work with Finnair. And this is because basically Qantas are kind of short of wide body, traditionally international aircraft. And they've been struggling to get hold of new ones, as everyone's struggling to get hold of planes. And so they agreed this wet lease deal with Finnair to start, I think it is from Sydney to Singapore in late October, and then flights between Sydney and Bangkok from March next year. Now, this decision provoked a furious response from one of the pilots' unions, who basically said, I think it was like an absence of fleet planning that it would kind of come down to this. But it was sort of supported by the Flight Attendants Association of Australia, which is basically the kind of big cabin crew union. But Jake, we've seen a story this week that now they are sort of withdrawing their support and saying that they've been misled about the whole thing. Jake, talk us a little bit more about this.
Yeah, the Flight Attendants Association of Australia has said that they've accused Qantas of what they say is a breathtaking lack of transparency over the deal that will see the Finnair crew operate these flights. They've said that Qantas said that the agreement would save the jobs of Finnair staff who were doing it tough because of the situation in Russia, but they were later informed that the employees would be sourced from labour hire firms. Now, Qantas has denied this accusation, said it's been very upfront about the terms of the agreement, but the FAAA says, quote, Finnair use labour hire in a range of places around the world. However, it was presented to the FAAA that the arrangement would save the jobs of Finnair cabin crew, when in fact it's about expanding the offshore arrangements for Finnair with labour hire. The crew work for AAP, a labour hire provider, and not Finnair. Airlines around the world are driving down conditions of direct employees and offshoring their work where they can. And the union is also saying Qantas cabin crew are concerned that this is part of a wider offshoring strategy of Australian cabin crew for the Qantas group.
It is interesting because, again, this is yet more evidence that we're struggling to hold of planes, we're struggling to get hold of crew. This kind of skill shortage, this talent shortage in the aviation industry is very, very real. I think at the time that this Finnair, the Finnair deal was announced, and I think I said previously, one of the pilots' unions, called it a failure of fleet planning. How could a massive airline, globally recognised airline like Qantas, effectively go cap in hand to a relative minnow like Finnair? It feels that this is going to be one of the problems which is going to hinder Qantas and a lot of airlines' recoveries post-COVID, Chris.
Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes it's a case of poor fleet planning. Sometimes it's a case of we've got the go-ahead to start a new route. We want to start that new route, but in order to start that new route, we need to pull an aircraft from somewhere else. The solution is a wet lease or a dry lease. It's tough. I feel for them. On the flip side of the FAAA argument, Qantas also use labour hire offshore as well. So they want to be or they want to tread very carefully here, because Qantas also do use labour hire offshore for Jetstar and certain flights with the Qantas group as well. So offshore labour hire companies are nothing new to aviation. They don't have the benefit of being employed by an airline full-time, but instead they're employed by a company and contracted to a specific airline to fly in that airline's uniform and aircraft. So it's nothing new to the sector, but it'll be interesting to see how all of this unfolds. Yeah.
Look, personally, I think that Qantas and Bonza will probably bounce back from this. I don't think Qantas is finished, and also Australia is the land of the Flair go.
Wow, there we go. For those of you taking a shot for every joke and punny comes out, you'll be drunk now. You're already
Two shots,
people.
You're
already on the floor, aren't you?